The cowboy heard her screams in the barn. He broke the door and said, "She's free now." The sun had barely begun its descent behind the rolling hills when Jake heard it. A sound that pierced through the quiet evening air like a knife through butter. A desperate scream that made his blood run cold. He had been tending to his horse near the old water trough, brushing down the mare after a long day of riding the fence line, when that haunting cry reached his ears. It came from the direction of the abandoned barn at the edge of the property, the one that hadn't been used in years, the one everyone said was falling apart and too dangerous to enter. Jake froze for a moment, his hand still clutching the brush, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. There it was again, another scream, this one more desperate, more terrified than the first. Without a second thought, Jake dropped the brush and ran. His boots kicked up dust as he sprinted across the dried grass, his cowboy hat nearly flying off his head as he moved faster than he had in months. The barn loomed ahead of him, its weathered wood dark against the orange sky, its door hanging slightly askew on rusted hinges. As he got closer, he could hear more than just screaming now. There were voices, harsh and angry, the sound of something being knocked over, wood splintering. His jaw clenched as rage began to build inside him alongside the fear. Someone was in trouble, someone was being hurt, and he wasn't about to let that continue. Jake reached the barn and didn't hesitate. The old door was held shut by a heavy wooden beam that had been wedged through the handles, clearly placed there deliberately to trap whoever was inside. He could hear her now, clearer than before, a woman's voice pleading, begging someone to stop. There were other voices too, men's voices, laughing cruelly, taunting her. Jake's hands gripped the wooden beam and he yanked it free with all his strength, tossing it aside where it clattered against the ground. He grabbed the door handles and pulled, but the old hinges had swollen with rust and moisture, refusing to budge. The screams came again, more desperate this time, and Jake felt something snap inside him. He took several steps back, then charged forward, slamming his shoulder into the door with every ounce of force he could muster. The wood groaned and cracked but didn't give way. He backed up again, his shoulder already aching, and charged once more. This time there was a loud splintering sound as the old wood began to fracture. One more time, he told himself, one more time and he'd break through. He gathered himself, took a running start, and hit the door with everything he had. The wood exploded inward, pieces flying as the door gave way completely, and Jake stumbled into the dim interior of the barn. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness inside, but what he saw made his blood boil. There in the center of the barn, surrounded by old hay bales and broken equipment, was a young woman. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her hands bound with rough rope. Standing around her were three men, rough-looking characters that Jake didn't recognize, clearly not from around these parts. They had been in the process of rifling through a bag that must have belonged to her, probably looking for money or valuables. When the door exploded inward and Jake came stumbling through, they all froze, caught in the act like animals in headlights. For a long moment, nobody moved. The woman looked up at Jake with wide, terrified eyes, hope and fear mingling in her expression. The three men slowly turned to face him, their surprise quickly morphing into aggression. The largest of them, a bearded man with cold eyes, took a step forward, his hand moving to his belt where Jake could see the outline of a knife. The barn suddenly felt very small, very confined, and Jake realized he might have just put himself in serious danger. But as he looked at the frightened woman, saw the marks on her wrists where the rope had cut into her skin, saw the terror in her eyes, he knew he couldn't back down now. He wouldn't back down. Jake straightened up to his full height, his hand instinctively moving to rest near his own belt. He wasn't carrying his gun. He rarely did when working around the ranch, but these men didn't need to know that. His fingers tapped against the leather of his belt in a way that suggested he might be armed, and he fixed the three men with the hardest stare he could muster. His voice when he spoke was low and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He told them simply and directly that the woman was coming with him, that they were going to step aside and let them both walk out of that barn, and that if they had any sense at all, they would be long gone from this property before the sheriff arrived. The bearded man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the confined space. He told Jake he must be crazy, walking in here alone, thinking he could tell them what to do. The other two men spread out slightly, flanking their leader, trying to surround Jake. They clearly thought they had the advantage, 3 against 1, in an isolated barn where nobody would hear or see what happened. But they hadn't counted on Jake's determination or his knowledge of this old barn. He had played here as a child, knew every corner, every loose board, every weakness in its structure. Jake didn't wait for them to make the first move. He grabbed an old pitchfork that was leaning against the wall nearby and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the men to stumble backward. He told them again, more forcefully this time, that the woman was leaving, that this was their last chance to walk away. The bearded man's face darkened with anger and he reached for his knife, pulling it free from its sheath. The blade gleamed in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. The other two men also armed themselves, one grabbing a length of wood, the other pulling out what looked like a small club. What happened next was a blur of motion and chaos. Jake swung the pitchfork again, this time aiming for the bearded man's midsection. The man dodged to the side, but the rusty tines caught his shirt, tearing through the fabric. One of the other men charged from the side, swinging his wooden club at Jake's head. Jake ducked under the blow and drove the handle of the pitchfork into the man's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The third man grabbed Jake from behind, trying to pin his arms, but Jake drove his heel down hard on the man's instep and then slammed his head backward, connecting with the man's nose. He felt and heard the crunch and the grip on his arms loosened. The bearded man came at him with the knife, slashing wildly. Jake stumbled backward, the blade missing him by inches. He swung the pitchfork again, but the man was ready this time, grabbing the handle and trying to wrestle it away from him. They struggled, spinning in a circle, crashing into old equipment and hay bales. Jake could hear the woman screaming, telling them to stop, her voice raw with terror. He couldn't let these men win, couldn't let them hurt her any more than they already had. With a burst of strength born from desperation, Jake twisted the pitchfork sharply, breaking the bearded man's grip, then swung the handle around, catching him across the jaw. The man went down hard, dazed. The other two men had recovered and were coming at him again, but Jake was ready. He positioned himself between them and the woman, his makeshift weapon held ready. He told them one final time that they could leave now, leave and never come back, or they could stay and face what was coming. His voice carried such conviction, such determination that even in their anger and aggression, the men hesitated. They looked at their leader, still on the ground holding his jaw, then back at Jake, then at each other. The calculation was visible in their eyes. They were weighing their options, deciding if this was worth the trouble, worth potentially getting seriously hurt or killed. Finally, the bearded man climbed to his feet, spitting blood onto the hay-covered floor. He glared at Jake with pure hatred, but seemed to recognize that the situation had turned against them. He jerked his head toward the broken door, signaling his companions to retreat. The three men backed toward the exit, never taking their eyes off Jake, their expressions promising revenge if they ever crossed paths again. Jake stood his ground, pitchfork still raised, watching them until they disappeared through the doorway. He could hear their footsteps as they ran, the sound of a vehicle starting up somewhere in the distance, then the roar of an engine as they fled. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did Jake lower the pitchfork and turn to the woman. She was still sitting on the ground, her bound hands in front of her, her whole body trembling with shock and relief. Jake quickly crossed the barn and knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he examined the ropes around her wrists. The knots were tight, deliberately cruel, cutting into her skin. He pulled out his pocket knife and carefully cut through the rope, freeing her hands. The moment she was free, The woman collapsed forward, sobbing, her forehead resting against Jake's shoulder as all the terror and relief overwhelmed her at once. Jake didn't know what to say. He had never been good with words, had always been more comfortable with horses and cattle than with people. But he placed a tentative hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some small comfort. He told her softly that she was safe now, that those men were gone, that nobody was going to hurt her anymore. "She's free now," he said, and hearing those words spoken aloud seemed to break something inside her. She cried harder, but he could sense it was different now, not the desperate, terrified sobs from before, but the release of someone who had been holding on to fear for too long. After several minutes, the woman's crying began to subside. She pulled back slightly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dirt on her face. She tried to speak to thank him, but her voice cracked and broke. Jake shook his head, telling her she didn't need to thank him, that any decent person would have done the same. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. How many people would have heard those screams and run toward them instead of away? How many would have broken down that door, faced 3 armed men, put their own life at risk for a stranger? He helped her to her feet, noting how she winced and favored one leg, clearly injured during her ordeal. He offered to carry her, but she shook her head stubbornly, determined to walk out of that barn on her own 2 feet. He respected that, understood the need to reclaim some control, some dignity after being so helpless. But he stayed close beside her, ready to catch her if she stumbled, as they made their way slowly toward the broken door and the evening light beyond. Outside the barn, the world seemed almost surreally peaceful. The sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Jake's horse was still standing by the water trough, patiently waiting. The normal sounds of the ranch evening, crickets chirping, birds settling in for the night, created a stark contrast to the violence that had just occurred. The woman stopped just outside the barn, tilting her face up toward the sky, breathing in deep gulps of the fresh air as if she had been suffocating inside. Jake gave her a moment before gently suggesting they get up to the main house, get her cleaned up, call the sheriff. She nodded slowly, but when she tried to take a step, her injured leg gave out and she stumbled. This time Jake didn't ask permission. He simply scooped her up in his arms, surprised at how light she was, and began carrying her toward the house. She didn't protest, just rested her head against his chest, exhausted beyond words. As they walked, she finally began to speak, her voice quiet and halting. She told him her name was Sarah, that she had been traveling through the area on her way to visit family in the next county. Her car had broken down on the highway and those men had pulled over, offering to help. She had been wary but desperate, and they had seemed friendly at first. They had driven her to what they said was a mechanic's shop, but instead they had brought her here, to this abandoned barn. They had been planning to rob her, maybe worse, and had locked her in that barn while they searched through her belongings and decided what to do with her. Jake felt his jaw clench again as he listened to her story. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated evil, made him sick. He told her she didn't have to talk about it right now if she didn't want to, that there would be time for all of that later with the sheriff. But she shook her head, said she needed to talk, needed to say it out loud. So he listened as they walked, letting her get it all out, every frightening detail, every moment of terror when she thought nobody would find her, that nobody would hear her screams in that isolated barn. By the time they reached the main house, Sarah had told him everything, and in the telling, seemed to have regained some of her.